The America's Democrats podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, is made possible by contributions from our listeners. Want to do more? Go to americasdemocrats.org and click Donate. And thank you for allowing us to be your voice. And if you enjoy the show, please share it with your friends on Facebook and Twitter, and leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. This week, Erica Payne on her new book, Tax the Rich: How Lies, Loopholes, and Lobbyists Make the Rich Even Richer. Sasha Issenberg on his new book, The Engagement, America's quarter-century struggle over same-sex marriage. Plus, Bill Press with Jaime Williams, president of the Wilderness Society, on what has to happen to avert climate catastrophe. Had enough of Fox News, the House Freedom Caucus, and Donald Trump? If you want the facts that you won't get from them or from the fake news sites of the alt-right, then stay tuned. Our sponsor, 21st Century Democrats, works hard to get everyday Democrats involved in returning our party to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Sit back and listen, then stand up and fight. And follow 21st Century Democrats on Facebook for all the latest progressive news. We're glad you can join us. In 2010, Erica Payne organized some of the richest Americans to demand higher taxes on millionaires like themselves. Her new book offers an insider's view of how the wealthy have rigged the tax code in their favor and offers a blueprint to unrig it. And we say hello to Erica Payne, founder and president of the Patriotic Millionaires. Recently, she is co-author with Morris Pearl of Tax the Rich: How Lies, Loopholes, and Lobbyists Make the Rich Even Richer. Erica Payne, thanks very much for joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast.
I'm so happy to be here. Thank you.
Well, it's our pleasure to have you with us. Now, tell me about your new book and your involvement with Patriotic Millionaires.
Sure. So the new book is called Tax the Rich: How Lies, Loopholes, and Lobbyists Make the Rich Even Richer. We wrote this book after working on tax policy for coming up on 11 years. In 2010, during the lame duck session of Congress, it became pretty clear that President Obama was going to cave to Republican demands to extend the Bush tax cuts. And that was really infuriating to a group of us. So I got a bunch of millionaires to sign a letter basically saying, for the good of the country, raise our taxes. And the message really exploded in the media. The idea that a bunch of millionaires wanted to pay higher taxes was shocking to the media and to the public. And we've been working together ever since to try to correct the egregious wrong that is our tax code. Your book is a deep dive into how the current tax code is at the expense of working people. Tell us about that. Basically, about 70% of Americans think the economy is rigged against them. And they are right. The economy is rigged against ordinary Americans. And then the question is, okay, how do you rig an economy? Well, the best first place to start to rig an economy is through the tax code. And what we have created within this country now is a tax code that virtually guarantees that we will become more unequal even more quickly over time. So right now, America is suffering from destabilizing historic levels of inequality. We're at the highest level of inequality we have been at in 100 years. And that inequality is the root cause of social unrest. Throughout history, when inequality gets to a certain level, you can almost predict and guarantee that social unrest will follow. So anybody who looks around, whatever political persuasion you are, you can look around and say something has gone wrong in America. People are just not happy. They're not getting along with each other. Well, what is the underlying root cause of that? The root cause of that is a dynamic whereby a very small number of people are getting enormously rich, and they're getting enormously rich at the expense of everyone else.
Well, and we're living in a time of great inequality in terms of both wealth and income. How does a tax code that favors the rich make that worse?
We've created an economy where if you make money off of your money, you end the year richer than if you make money off of work. Let me give you a little more detail of that. So in the book, One of the core points in the book is the differentiation between how ordinary income that people get from a job is taxed as compared to how income from investments is taxed. And so we compare two couples, the work hearts and the slumps. The work hearts go to work all year long, 40 hours a week, 50 weeks a year. The slumps are already rich, so they hang out, drink strawberry daiquiris on the beach. What happens when they make money? So the working people, say they make $100,000 combined income. They go to their jobs, they come home, they get a paycheck. They make $100,000. After their standard deduction, they pay around a little less than $9,000 in taxes. In contrast, the slumps who have been drinking strawberry daiquiris, sitting on the beach all day, playing golf, if they sell $100,000 worth of stock that they own, so their income is also $100,000, but it's from the work of pushing a button on an E-Trade account, they will pay $0 in taxes on that money. So they made a capital gain. Capital gains are taxed at about half the rate of ordinary income. So here on one side, we have the work hearts working hard, the slumps drinking strawberry daiquiris, playing golf. And even if those two couples make the exact same amount of money, one by working, one by selling off some stocks, the work hearts end every year $9,000 poorer than the slumps. So that's the beginning of what basically our entire tax code is designed to do. It is designed to make sure that the rich get richer and everybody else is left holding the bag. And tax policy is so complicated that it's sort of, I think people feel like this is happening. They kind of generally know that this is happening, but they don't understand the specifics of it. So we wrote this book so ordinary people without accounting degrees could figure out what in the world has gone wrong in America. And one of the big things that has gone wrong is that we have been appeasing multimillionaires, billionaires, and corporations for decades. And we have left middle class and working class Americans holding the bag for keeping this country running, and it has to stop.
We're speaking with Erica Payne, founder and president of the Patriotic Millionaires. Recently, she is co-author with Morris Pearl of Tax the Rich, How Lies, Loopholes, and Lobbyists Make the Rich Even Richer. And Erica, it's not uncommon to hear rich people say they are job creators, so they deserve a tax break. But what's wrong with that argument?
Well, the central thing that's wrong with the argument is that it's dumb and it's wrong, and it's been proven to be wrong over and over and over again, and it doesn't stop them from using it. And it's one of the things that makes me the craziest about this whole conversation. The rich in this country basically set out this narrative that is, if you ask me to do anything reasonable, I will take all of my marbles and go home, and you will be left destitute. The job creator argument is one of the ones that they lean into on this. I'll give you some examples, right? Randall Stephenson, who's the former CEO of AT&T, in 2017, when Republicans rewrote the entire federal tax code, Randall Stephenson ran all over the country insisting that the correlation between tax cuts for corporations and job creation was, quote, very, very tight. Well, during the time period from 2008 to 2015, AT&T's effective corporate tax rate was around 8%. That was well below the statutory rate at the time of 35%. So according to Mr. Stephenson's logic, during that period of time, you would have assumed that AT&T had hired a number of people given that 8% tax rate. Well, during that time, they laid off 40,000 people. After the tax cut was passed, after the millionaire tax cut was passed in 2017, and corporations went from 35% to 21% while keeping all of the loopholes and shenanigans that they had in there before. AT&T the following year laid off another 40,000 people. And so even these titan heads of industry, want to pay lower taxes, and they don't care if they have to lie to the people in the country in order to do it. Randall Stephenson, bald-faced, lied to the American people when he said that tax cuts are a job creator. They are not a job creator. And they use that as an excuse to get out of their obligation for doing what they need to do for the country. The only job creator in the world is consumer demand. Okay. So even if you look at a company like Apple, Apple doesn't make money because of its investors. It makes money because people line up around the corner to buy iPhones and computers and every other kind of product. If you don't have those people standing in line, then you don't have any people who have to help those people find the right computer or iPhone for them. The consumers themselves are the job creators. And that makes it particularly perverse what we are doing and creating this level of inequality, because we're essentially killing our customer base. When we take more and more money from the bottom and pile it on the top, we are limiting the fluid dollars that people will spend to generate job creation. And we're doing it in order to benefit a tiny number of people. And in the words of my friend Ben Cohen, who's the co-founder of Ben and Jerry's, there's only so much chunky monkey one rich guy can eat.
And what is the role of politics in all of this? I mean, on the one hand, we could understand how a fair taxes position could play across voting lines. But even if it did, would that be enough to counteract the interest of big donors who are funding campaigns?
I think that it largely is not. It has not proven to date to be enough. Taxing multimillionaires, billionaires, and corporations is wildly popular with the American public across party lines. The vast majority of Democrats and independents, as well as the majority of Republicans, believe rich people in this country should pay substantially higher taxes. The only people who disagree with that incredibly unremarkable notion are the lawmakers in charge and the people who fund their campaigns. Let me give you a case in point. David Koch, after the 2017 rewrite of the entire federal tax code, Paul Ryan, who was Speaker of the House at the time, was in charge of that. When the day, it was like the day or the week after that, that tax rewrite passed, David Koch, the Koch brothers, sent Paul Ryan $500,000 to his leadership PAC. They then pledged $20 million to go sell the American people on this crappy deal. They did it by running a job creators bus tour. So they're leaning into that branding. The Koch brothers are estimated to have saved upward of $1.5 billion from that rewrite of the federal tax code. So they invest $20 million in a tour, $500,000 to the people who sold out America, sold out their fellow citizens, and handed the store to a rich billionaire. And that rich billionaire stands to benefit $1.5 billion.
And if there was political will, what's on the top of your list to change the tax system?
So there are a couple of things that we need to do immediately. One is we need to equalize ordinary income and capital gains tax rates for any income over $1 million. This is something I want to be clear to. The patriotic millionaires focus only on taxing people with incomes of $1 million or wealth of $5 million or more. We actually disagree with the Biden administration, who is saying that they are comfortable raising taxes on people over 400,000. We believe that number should be $1 million. Let's start with $1 million. And so the first thing we need to do is we need to equalize ordinary income and capital gains rates over $1 million. There are then a series of loopholes that we need to address. There's a thing called the 1031 exchange, which basically allows rich real estate developers to build enormous portfolios of real estate assets, pass them on to their heirs, and basically never pay a single thing in taxes. There's a loophole called the stepped up basis, which is one of the pieces that we may be able to get fixed in this upcoming tax reform debate that's happening in Washington. The stepped up basis is this thing where basically if you die and leave your assets to your heirs, any increase in the value is eliminated for tax purposes. And so basically you can pass on huge assets to your heirs tax-free. A couple of things that aren't likely to happen but need to happen over the long term are a very substantial wealth tax. Right now, the only people in the country who pay wealth taxes are people who own homes, and they only pay wealth taxes on those homes. rich people may own multiple homes, but they hold most of their assets in other things like art, antique coin collections, privately held businesses, stock portfolios, things like that. So the only people currently paying a wealth tax are working people who own their home. Billionaires don't typically pay much of a wealth tax because they keep their money in other places other than their home. And so the only people carrying that are working class people. And we need to change that. We need to institute a very substantial wealth tax. There are a couple of other things that we talk about in the book, but those are some of the big chunks that we would really like to see achieved in this iteration. There's big debate happening in Washington about how to pay for the kind of infrastructure we need to support the kind of country we want to have. We think 100% of that money should come from multimillionaires, billionaires, and corporations is to do it.
Mm-hmm. And when we don't pay our fair share, does that undermine public faith in the whole tax system, even in government itself?
Well, 100%. Listen, everybody can look around and see that Jeff Bezos is going into space. And then he has the audacity and bad taste to thank the Amazon employees who work under extremely difficult circumstances. And he's basically sucking the money that they are making for him away from them and using it to buy himself a little rocket ship to go up to the moon. I just think the whole thing is gross, frankly. And Jeff Bezos pays, there is a ProPublica report that came out about the effective tax rate of most of these millionaires and billionaires. The vast majority of millionaires and billionaires pay nothing as a percentage of their income compared to what working people make. And in 2017, as I've said, the Republicans rewrote the entire federal tax code. In 2018, for the first time in American history, billionaires paid a lower effective tax rate than every other group of people in the country. And so, you look at people just getting away with murder. It's like any sort of social circumstance. If you see people getting special treatment, getting privileges that are not extended to other people, and these are people who have every amount of privilege already in the world, it just has to end. It's undermining the entire system, and you can see that again in all of the social unrest that's happening across the country.
Absolutely. Erica Payne, founder and president of the Patriotic Millionaires, co-author with Morris Pearl of Tax the Rich, How Lies, Loopholes, and Lobbyists Make the Rich Even Richer, joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast. Erica, thank you very much for joining us. We appreciate your time. We'd love to do it again soon.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
All right. And this is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen to this americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats. But we need you to stand up and fight. Do you want to get involved and help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box? You can make your contribution to help us keep this show going and to elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.
Social Security measure. I believe that we must pass legislation to provide medical care.
This is our tradition. When our grandparents came to America, it was the Democratic Party which said, welcome. It was the Democratic Party, the party of Roosevelt and Truman and Kennedy and others, who said that America belonged to all its people, not just a handful of the rich or a few giant corporations. That's why great leaders like FDR fought so hard for Social Security, and why JFK stood up to the insurance companies and their Republican allies to get Medicare. It's not just one thing, or one time, in one place. It's about a whole history of standing up to the Republicans and saying someone has to be on the side of regular working people in America, whether it's defending Social Security or just the way your loved ones are treated on the job. That's what the Democratic Party is all about. And that's why this message has been brought to you by the Democratic Party. Working people like you and me.
Paid for by 21st Century Democrats. Not authorized by any candidate or candidates committee. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. Coming up next, what we can learn from the fight for marriage equality. But first, we turn to Jim Hightower, America's #1 populist, for his common sense commentary.
If you're a corporate employee, you know that something unpleasant is afoot when top executives are suddenly issuing statements about how committed they are to their employees, making sure that all of them are treated with dignity and respect. For example, the PR chief of a global outfit named Teleperformance, one of the world's largest call centers, was recently going on and on about how, quote, "we value our people and their well-being, safety, and happiness." Why did the corporation feel such a desperate need to proclaim its virtue? Because it's been caught in a nasty scheme to spy on its own workers. Teleperformance, a $6.7 billion global behemoth that handles customer service calls for Amazon, Apple, Uber, etc., saves money on overhead by making most of its 380,000 employees around the world work from their own homes. That can be a convenience for many workers, but a new corporate policy, first imposed in March on thousands of its workers in Colombia, is an Orwellian nightmare. Teleperformance is pressuring them to sign an 8-page addendum to their employee contracts, allowing corporate-controlled video cameras, electronic audio devices, and data collection tools to be put in their homes to monitor their actions. "I work in my bedroom," one employee noted. "I don't want to have a camera in my bedroom." Neither would I, and I doubt that Teleperformance's $20 million a year CEO would allow one in his mansion. Uglier yet, the privacy-obliterating contract requires that even the children of employees can be spied on at home. Nonetheless, the Colombian worker signed because her supervisor said she could lose her job if she refused. Of course, Teleperformance Inc. assures us that the data it collects on children is not shared elsewhere. But how do we know that? Trust us, they say. This is Jim Hightower saying, do you? Howdy-ho, folks. Thanks for tuning in and sharing my weekly commentaries. Also, please join me for a live web show I host every other Tuesday, the Hightower Lowdown Happy Hour at the Chat and Chew Cafe. You can join the action live online as I chat with grassroots leaders and progressive sparklies from around the country. Go to hightowerlowdown.org/chat-and-chew to find out about upcoming guests and watch past episodes. That's hightowerlowdown.org/chat-and-chew.
This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. In his newest book, Sasha Issenberg chronicles the 25 years that led up to marriage equality. It tells the story of how same-sex marriage went from fringe to mainstream and explores what can be learned for ongoing civil rights movements. And we say hello to journalist Sasha Issenberg, also the author most recently of The Engagement, America's Quarter-Century Struggle Over Same-Sex Marriage. Sasha also teaches in the political science department at UCLA. Sasha Issenberg, thanks very much for joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast.
Great to be here, Jim. Thanks.
Well, our pleasure to have you with us. Now, what made you decide this was a book that needed to be written?
So about 10 years ago, I was working on my last book, which was about the science of political campaigns, and just heard from a lot of pollsters and people who dealt with political opinion in some form or another. They'd never seen attitudes move as quickly on a single issue as they had seen it on same-sex marriage. And that just struck me as somebody who covered political campaigns as this really interesting puzzle, because nobody had a particularly good explanation for how and why it had happened. And we were already starting to talk about this as the defining civil rights movement of my generation. And I realized that I had no idea like where this issue had come from, how it had come in a certain way to take over our politics, and how we'd gotten from wherever there was to wherever here was. And it was already sort of clear that the country was approaching consensus on this. And I felt that the time was right to sort of go back and take a first cut at the sort of political and legal history of the whole arc of this issue.
And as you noted, our nation went through an immense change over same-sex marriage in a relatively short period of time. But remind us where we were on this issue just 25 years ago.
Yeah, so 25 years ago this year, the Defense of Marriage Act passed Congress and was signed into law by Bill Clinton. It was the reaction to a court case in Hawaii that had basically come out of nowhere. A petty local feud within a pride planning committee in Honolulu starting in 1989 sprawled out of control. And one activist had a PR stunt turned into a long shot lawsuit. And to the surprise of basically everybody involved, in May of 1993, the Hawaii Supreme Court became the first court anywhere on earth to rule that the fundamental right to marriage could apply to same-sex couples. And before that, there was not a gay rights group in the United States that had defined marriage equality as an objective. Opponents of gay rights were fighting on all sorts of fronts, but they were not trying to stop gays and lesbians from marrying because none of them were trying to. There was barely a politician in the United States that had been ever been asked his or her opinion on the issue. It basically came out of nowhere.
Mm-hmm. Well, even within, I should say, the gay rights movement, there was some reluctance to take on this issue. How do you explain that, and what changed to create a more coherent movement for gay marriage?
So some of it was strategic, that you go back to the 1980s and there were incremental gains in other areas, getting non-discrimination laws at the local level, getting hate crimes statutes to cover sexual orientation, just like they do race and religion, getting HIV/AIDS funding. And so there were some people who just said, this is too big of a lift where it's not gettable and we should focus on things that are sort of more incremental, small bore. But there was also sort of ideological divide within the gay and lesbian community, mostly among lawyers and legal theorists, activists. And there were some who came out of sort of the liberationist world of post-Stonewall, who argued that sort of gays and lesbians had succeeded in creating their own sexual values and mores that were distinct from mainstream American society. So like, why would we aspire to inclusion in, to paraphrase one critic, why would we want to replicate the white picket fence suburban middle classness of our 1950s parents? And you also had some women, lesbians, who had, like lesbian family law lawyers, especially, who had gone to college and law school in the 60s and 70s, had sort of been conditioned by second wave feminism to think of marriage as an institution that existed to subjugate women. And from their perspective, why would we as women want to make a political priority out of winning acceptance into an institution that is not designed for us? And this split sort of, persisted until that period between when the Hawaii decision came down and when the Defense of Marriage Act was introduced, and what ultimately united the gay rights community to think marriage was something worth fighting for was that their opponents, initially the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, eventually Catholic and Mormon activists, and then sort of mainstream Republican politicians, were now dedicated above all to stopping gays and lesbians from having the right to marry anywhere. And all of a sudden, all these internal divides sort of fell away. And, I quote Paula Edelbrook, who is one of the sort of top lesbian critics of marriage in these debates in the 80s. And she says, all the world's blowing up because of our relationships. Our opponents are starting fires to stop us from getting married. Of course, I'm going to defend our right to do it.
Mm-hmm. And so we see over time, public opinion shifts in favor of gay marriage in a pretty powerful way. How do you now understand our dramatic shift? Was this just good organizing on the part of gay rights activists, or was there more to it?
I think there were some choices around tactics and strategy that benefited this movement. We know from a lot of research that the biggest part of this is, I think, people coming out and circles of people around them recognizing that they know someone who's gay or lesbian and coming to understand why they want to marry. It's the best predictor of liberal attitudes on a whole suite of gay rights issues, not just marriage, has been how somebody answers the polling question: do you have a friend, family, coworker who's openly gay or lesbian? And when that question first got asked in I think 1983, it was 20-something%. And now I think it's close to 100%. And what we see is that people across, partisan lines and such start to shift their views on these issues. We've seen it with prominent politicians when they know somebody in their immediate life who wants to be gay, and they understand that, gays and lesbians want to marry for the same reason that they do.
Mm-hmm. And all of a sudden you realize that, well, gosh, that person's the same person that they were before I knew that they were a gay, lesbian, whatever it is. I mean, that certainly has to help, and especially crossing that political divide. But even as public opinion changed, there were some politicians, especially Republicans, that were slow to catch up. When did being anti-gay marriage stop being a platform that could actually work for a conservative politician?
I mean, Republicans stopped talking about it more than I think many of them ended up changing their position. So, what was really notable is I read a lot about what happened within the Obama White House in the year leading up to Obama changing his position, which, as we remember, was sort of instigated by Biden sort of blurting out what appeared to be a change of position. And there had already been plans within the White House for Obama to announce a switch. And, one of their concerns was that Mitt Romney, who was the likely opponent, would sort of hop on this. They already wanted to attack Romney for being a flip-flopper, that this would become a sort of problematic issue in an election year. And one thing that was really notable is Obama announces his switch, and Romney puts out one statement about it saying, whatever, but says, like, I don't think this should be an issue in the campaign. And, there was no sense that there was opportunity to be gained there. And obviously 4 years earlier, Obama's own advisors thought that he was basically faking it when he said that that his Christian faith led him to believe that marriage was between a man and a woman because it was sort of unimaginable. None of the top tier Democratic candidates for president in 2008, they all supported civil unions. None of them supported marriage rights. And so it was in that period from 2008 to 2012 that you get this big shift. I think one big indicator of it was 10 years ago, I think almost to this week, Andrew Cuomo signed into law the marriage equality bill in New York State. New York became the first large state to legalize same-sex marriage through the political process as opposed to via the courts. And it was, Cuomo then as now is an incredibly both ambitious and cautious calculating politician, not a guy who takes a lot of risks, and obviously not a sort of, wild-eyed leftist in any respect. And he saw this as sort of safe enough to do, and that there was no downside to doing it. And I think that helped affirm. You saw Martin O'Malley do something very similar in Maryland. And it became sort of clear, I think, to national Democrats that the thing that they had feared in the years earlier, which is that you could be too far to the left of your party on this issue, just was no longer the case.
Mm-hmm. We're speaking to journalist Sasha Issenberg, who also teaches in the political science department at UCLA and is the author most recently of The Engagement, America's Quarter-Century Struggle Over Same-Sex Marriage. As your book notes, Sasha, not all Democrats were on board as early as they could have been or should have been. What caused them to drag their feet, and what turned them to change their positions?
Yeah, so I think a lot of this, politicians are fundamentally risk averse, and this is a story throughout, both at the state level, going back to Hawaii, where politicians have followed public opinion rather than led it or drove it. And so I do think for Democrats in particular, the experience of 2004, which to some degree I think was misinterpreted and just generally traumatic, had a long-term influence on their thinking. And so what people came out of 2004 with a couple of stories. One was that Karl Rove had sort of deviously picked same-sex marriage as the issue that Bush was going to run for re-election on, had gotten Bush behind the federal marriage amendment, the effort to amend the U.S. Constitution to ban same-sex marriage, and then that Rove sort of strategically put 13 ballot measures up for a vote to drive evangelical turnout in November 2004. And that this had been the deciding issue. This is as the sort of mythology went. This had been the deciding issue. It helped Bush win Ohio. And if Rove hadn't done this to sort of, create a wedge issue and drive out evangelicals, Bush wouldn't have been reelected. There's a lot of evidence from political scientists that second part of it is just not really true. There's not much reason to believe that evangelical turnout was higher in the places that it was on the ballot, for example. or that Bush did better in those places. But the other part of it, which, in my research was a surprise to me, was how the Bush White House wasn't driving this. And the dynamic, in fact, was a lot more like what you might see right now from progressive interest groups who have a sort of putative ally in the White House, but constantly feel like they're being taken for granted or disrespected. And religious conservative activists came together in 2003 and created this new sort of secret cadre called the Arlington Group. And their whole issue was that they thought Bush and Roe basically had taken them for granted, and they wanted to find an issue that they could use to press the White House to go further on sort of Christian priorities. And they picked marriage, and they spent a whole year trying to get the White House to get behind a federal marriage amendment. But I think that Democrats came out of that loss. 2 days after the election, Dianne Feinstein says that gay marriage was the reason that John Kerry lost. That becomes, a sort of widely held view that gay marriage is counterproductive for Democrats, and that the sort of God, gays, guns trinity was sort of the perilous place for Democrats to be, and that their biggest problem was that they were seen as too culturally left and out of sync for middle America. And you see in the way that, Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama campaigned for president 4 years later, that's really driving their concerns. And I think Obama's victory and the sense, that the rising American electorate would help Democrats, and that they could win on the backs of a coalition of young people, unmarried women, voters of color, sort of changed Democrats' general calculations of where the risk was. That there are areas where you stood to benefit from going a little farther to the left than you might have, and there are not as many votes in the center now because the parties are so polarized.
Mm-hmm. Well, now, of course, the legalization of gay marriage could not have happened without courts and judges, even before the 2015 decision by the Supreme Court. What's your sense of how legal thinking began to coalesce on this issue?
So all the early cases that were successful, starting with that Hawaii one in the early 90s, and then a case in Vermont that where the court ruled that the current marriage law is discriminatory, but basically goaded the legislature to creating what became civil unions, and then the breakthrough case in Massachusetts that led to the first legal marriages in the U.S. In 2004. Were all done in state courts and under state constitutions. And there was throughout this time, a sort of understood sense among gay rights litigators that you could not risk going into federal court. Up until 2003, the Supreme Court still followed a precedent that states could ban private consensual gay sex. And there was a just general understanding that you went into the Rehnquist court and you were not going to be able to make much progress on any gay rights issues, let alone recognizing marriage. And so the initial successes were all in state courts, often with the idiosyncrasies of state constitutions that are all written differently. And one of the biggest challenges that gay and lesbian litigators had, which they were, very quiet about, I write about it in my book, but they never publicized at the time, was that when there would be these victories, the victory in Hawaii, success in Vermont and Massachusetts, it often inspired sort of rank and file gays and lesbians around the country to say, oh, I'm going to sue in Florida, or I'm going to sue in New Jersey, or wherever I live. And those cases were, the jobs of lawyers often became shutting down those potential lawsuits out of fear that they could set bad precedents. And so they were trying to actually impose more organization and order and coordination on individual plaintiffs to make sure that if you are suing in state courts, you're doing it in places where you stand a chance of winning, and that you're keeping people out of federal court. Because if this got to the Supreme Court too early, it could set a precedent that not only blocked a path back to the court on marriage, but could set back a whole lot of other gay rights issues if the court ruled in a more expansive way. And you sort of just lose control of your fight when you do that.
Mm-hmm. Now, you recently spoke at an event sponsored by The Hill titled America's Unfinished Business, an LGBTQ plus summit. What is the unfinished business, and what can be learned from the battle for gay marriage that can be useful to gay rights activists moving forward?
Yeah, so I think under the big sort of LGBTQ umbrella, the big issue those related to trans rights and sort of sexual identity, gender identity more generally. And, I think one of the big breakthroughs, as we talked about, Jim, is like, we saw the impact that people coming out has on public opinion. One of the things that's different about race, about sexual orientation and gender identity too, from race or sex or often religion, is that people control the circumstances, timing of the decision to recognize and disclose and announce who they are. And we see the power that had for gays and lesbians in winning acceptance. And I think that we have every reason to believe that something similar is happening with trans issues. I just think we need to recognize we're pretty early, and the numbers of Americans who say they know somebody who's transgender is very similar to where it was for gays and lesbians in the early 80s. And that I think that there's a sort of organic change that'll happen. One of the things that's worth noting is that gays and lesbians are born to, almost by definition, heterosexual parents. Trans kids are born often to cisgender parents. African American kids are not born to white parents. Immigrant kids are not born to native born parents. Catholic kids are not born to Jewish parents. There's a sort of natural diversification that comes along with what we understand biology to be here. And that's probably going to serve a progressive purpose for trans rights campaigners. But what I also show in my book is that there were efforts that the gay marriage campaigners made to try to package that in campaigns, how you built your field campaign so that you had canvassers or phone bank callers talking to voters about being gay and why they wanted to get married, doing changing the advertising so that gay and lesbian couples were at the forefront, which they were not for many years. And I think that there are ways that folks in the transgender community can understand, can sort of develop tactical lessons. And I think a lot of other social movements can as well, about how you personalize your communications so that the voter who's receiving them comes away with some of the feeling of having had contact with a gay or lesbian person, or in this case, a transgender person.
Mm-hmm. It can only help open the eyes of people in general, and I think probably I would think help those that have been cloaked in the dark, that they feel like they know who they are, but they don't feel comfortable being able to express that to anybody. Hopefully this is a path to making that easier for them so that they can live their lives the way that they should be living their lives.
Yeah, there's obviously a cycle here where some degree of social acceptance is necessary for individuals to feel comfortable coming out. They come out, the people around them understand, as we talked about, that they know somebody who's gay or trans, and that they're not that different, and that creates more social acceptance, and on and on. And I think pop culture and the general cultural ambiance, helps do that too. And that's just a sort of cycle that's going to take place. I mean, the other part of it, I would say that is worth thinking about is just how much our broad cultural understanding of sexual orientation has changed over the years. I mean, in researching this book, spent a lot of time, consuming press coverage from the 1990s. And every time you read a Time or Newsweek story about any gay rights issue from the 90s, there'll always be a paragraph that's like, to be sure, we don't know whether homosexuality is a matter of nature or nurture. Scientists disagree. And now, nobody talks that way,
Right.
Even people who are opposed to LGBT rights do not claim that it is a choice or a lifestyle. Back in the 90s, you had people who said we can't legalize marriage because it'll incentivize people to become gay, or will encourage kids to become gay if they know that they can get married or something like that. That's just not on the table anymore. And that's not just because we changed the way we talk about sexual orientation. It's because we talk about addiction differently. We talk about temper, personality. We just, as a society, accept that people are born with a whole lot of stuff that they don't control. And that is, the results very far downstream from scientific findings, but then just kind of become culturally accepted. And then the question becomes, okay, there are going to be people who are gay and lesbian. Now, what's a fair way to have a set of laws and societal rules that both respect them and that, encourages them to lead like healthy lives for themselves and for their broader community. And I suspect that the science of sexual identity and how lay people, non-scientists as a result, come to understand why somebody identifies as one gender or the other, or is non-binary. I think I just have to assume that that's going to change a lot in the next 5, 10, 15 years, and that the foundation on which we have the discussions about the political and legal issues will shift as a result.
Okay. Journalist Sasha Issenberg joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast. Of course, he's author most recently of The Engagement, America's quarter-century struggle over same-sex marriage. Sasha, great to have you with us today. We'd love to have you back and do it again soon.
Appreciate it, Jim. I'd love to be back.
Thank you. And this is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Make your contribution to keep the americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, on the air, and help elect stand-up Democrats. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. And now Bill Press with Jaime Williams, president of the Wilderness Society, on key takeaways from the latest UN report on climate change and why it is an urgent call to action.
It is unequivocal that human influence has warmed the atmosphere, ocean, and land. So does that mean at least we can accept that now everybody accepts the fact that climate change is real and human activity caused it?
I think we can. I think we can certainly. What's clear here is that there's scientific consensus. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change includes hundreds of the best scientists around the world on climate. This document is the definitive document approved by 195 countries. And as you said, it is clearer than it's ever been before that, as you said, unequivocal that not only is global warming happening, but that human activity is responsible, and especially the burning of fossil fuels, which have caused the accumulation of excessive carbon in the atmosphere at higher levels than the last 2 million years. So I think the important thing now is to really take the kind of action that we're going to need to take so that the kind of extreme weather events and impacts that we're experiencing in all of our lives do not get worse.
What are the manifestations of climate change that you see today, which are so evident?
Oh gosh, it's just it's getting worse every day. And I mean, just think about this summer. I mean, the incredible record-shattering heat wave in the Pacific Northwest with temperatures in British Columbia, of all places, of 121 degrees. Mm-hmm. The devastating drought and fires in the American West. 93% of the American West is in drought. California had their worst fire season last year, and they're on record to break that record this year. And then, of course, we're seeing unprecedented flooding in countries around the world, in Germany and China, where they're seeing 1 in 1,000 year events. So, and one of the things that the report really makes clear is that there's a really strong scientific evidence now that links the intensity of these extreme weather events to climate, and that these are only going to get worse in the coming decades.
And the other thing that I saw in the report, which is unique, I think, in this report, is that the report documents that this climate change, the results of it, the manifestations of it, if you will, are happening everywhere on the planet, right? In every corner of the globe.
Absolutely. You can't hide. There's no place you can hide from climate change on the planet now. This is truly impacting the health and safety and well-being of everyone on the planet, as well as huge impacts to the biodiversity and millions of species that are being impacted. So it's not only an existential crisis that we're facing, but it's an urgent one in which we must act quickly. And I will add that there was a glimmer of hope in this report, which was that if we do we collectively around the world take immediate and drastic actions to cut emissions over the coming decade, we could still meet the aspirational goal of the Paris Climate Agreement of not warming the planet more than 1.5 degrees Celsius over pre-industrial levels. So this is really, we're seeing the impacts everywhere around the world. We're feeling them, and they're deadly, and it's awful. And at the same time, there's hope that if we take immediate action now, we can stabilize the climate ultimately and still be on a pathway to a sustainable future.
Well, I was encouraged by that message of hope, but at the same time, it was tempered by their statement that if we don't act, it's just going to get a hell of a lot worse and a hell of a lot faster. Right.
It's accelerating, and that's why the Secretary General of the UN called this report in particular a code red for humanity. I mean, this is undermining life as we know it, and if we don't act at scale, the consequences are really could become catastrophic. So the importance of taking action is really important. And, we are seeing what's encouraging is that most countries around the world have not only signed the Paris Agreement, but have committed or in the process of committing to net zero by 2050, including the United States and President Biden. But of course, what's going to be really important are the tangible actions that we take to actually get there.
So if there is a human cause to climate change, there's also a possible human fix, right? I mean, maybe not for a complete human fix, but at least slow it down to a point where we can live with the consequences. So I guess is that sort of how you sum things up?
Absolutely. I mean, what we've got, it's fairly simple, even though we've got to be comprehensive about it. But essentially, we just have to reduce our carbon emissions on a global level to something that the planet can sustain, and we've also got to protect nature and natural systems that naturally store and offset carbon, so that we can get back into balance. And that's really what the Paris Agreement calls for.
So, how much of it has to be focused on fossil fuels and either eliminating or reducing our dependency on fossil fuels? Is that the number one key goal here?
I would say it is the number one key goal. We've got to do both. We've got to reduce emissions, and we've got to protect forests and natural systems. But absolutely, we have to achieve both of those goals. Go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, there is a question about whether, certainly at one time on this planet, humankind survived without fossil fuels, without the use of fossil fuels. But that's been a long time ago. Given today's technology, right, and today's economy, is it possible to have a fossil-free economy?
Well, I certainly think we can get very close to, and that's why I think net zero ultimately is the goal. I think we have the technologies in renewable energy. We're not just talking about shutting down our dependence on energy. What we're talking about is transitioning from one technology, which is around extracting and burning fossil fuels, to another, which is clean, renewable energy, solar, wind, geothermal, which has been growing rapidly in this country. It's now over 10% of our electricity system. And if we really focused on investing in building this out and reduced the subsidies we have for fossil fuels, we could get to a clean electricity system by 2035, which is exactly what many states and what Biden is now calling for. So we've got to rapidly deploy renewable energy as we ramp down and phase out fossil fuels.
Right. So much of this, of course, requires government or legislative action. I think it was in the New York Times yesterday. I read an article where it's sort of a good news, bad news piece, Jamie. The good news was that there are almost no more climate deniers in the Republican Party. They don't go around like Jim Inhofe or whatever, denying climate change anymore. But what they do, however, do not accept, however, is the need to clamp down on fossil fuels or in any way put any more restrictions on the fossil fuel, on the oil and gas companies. That's not good enough, is it?
No, and it's not. And what the UN Secretary General said on this report is that if we don't ramp down aggressively fossil fuels, we will literally destroy their planet, or at least destroy our ability to live sustainably as we know on it if we don't do that. But we can do this in a way that transitions from one energy system to another, in a way that drives the economy and builds jobs, and will be a very prosperous future for us economically, as well as protect our health and well-being and those of the species that we all depend on for our survival.
So there's a big summit coming up November, right, in Glasgow in Scotland, where the nations, 195 nations or whatever, will convene again to talk about this problem and to commit to whatever action they're willing to take. I noticed in the report that the UN report came out last week again, they identify the top 10 producers of greenhouse gas emissions. So I just want to read the list to you. China, United States, the EU, India, Russia, Japan, Brazil, Indonesia, Iran, and Canada. Can't really count on all of them to come through, can we?
Well, I think we've got to continue to work with other countries through the kind of international agreements we've been building to get to a place where we are meeting climate targets on a global scale. And I think the Paris Agreement was very hopeful. I think we obviously need to build and strengthen that agreement in this next conference. But look, China is the biggest emitter, as you said, and they've committed to net zero by 2060. We know that we're the second biggest emitter, and we've committed to net zero by 2050 and to cut half of our emissions by 2030. And I think if take significant actions here, both legislatively and within the Biden administration, we could actually achieve those goals. So every country is going to have to do its part. And I think the best way to get other countries to do their part is for us, as one of the biggest polluters in the world, to lead by example. We need to show global leadership in solving this crisis. And that's what really got us to Paris. And I think that that's what's going to get us to even stronger agreements, which is what we need.
I know a lot of people, myself, a lot of friends of mine, and yours, I'm sure, too, feel so frustrated by that because they're so concerned about the problem, but they see this as really that action has to happen at a governmental level or a national level. Is there anything that individuals can really do to help things along?
Well, sure. I mean, we have to do everything, and individual choices do matter. I mean, first, we have to transition to electric vehicles. So what kind of vehicle you buy matters. What kind of carbon footprint you have in your life. Do you fly all the time? So I think individual choices absolutely matter and help drive demand for the right solutions. Secondly, I think, yes, governments matter. We've got to solve this at a systemic government level, but governments reflect the will of the people. And so it's really important for people to advocate for the solutions that we need. We have a once-in-a-generation opportunity right now to put the United States on a sustainable path to solving the climate crisis. But that's going to take significant legislation and action by the Biden administration, which is all in process right now. which, by the way, is happening because of the kind of advocacy we've been seeing from people across the country. But that needs to continue to be strong. So individual choices, yes, are important. Advocacy is really important because at the end of the day, we need governmental action at a systemic level to really make the difference.
Bill Press with Jaime Williams, president of the Wilderness Society. If you'd like to hear the entire episode, visit billpresspods.com. And that's all for the America's Democrats podcast. Thank you to all who made today's show possible. Erica Payne, Sasha Issenberg, and the entire Bill Press team. And thank you for listening. If you liked what you heard, please get involved in our efforts to keep this show going and to elect Democrats who are bringing the party back to its roots. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. And be sure to find 21st Century Democrats on Facebook and Twitter, and leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. For the America's Democrats podcast, I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Join us. Support the americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, and help elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles with your contribution today. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.